The cleaning cart's squeaky wheel echoed through the marble hallway of the Torino Tower's 52nd floor, but Katerina Volkov barely heard it anymore. After 3 years of working nights in this gleaming monument to power and corruption, she had learned to move like a ghost through Lorenzo Torino's domain. The irony wasn't lost on her that the daughter of Dmitry Morozov, one of the most feared men in the Russian underworld, spent her evenings scrubbing toilets and emptying trash cans for the Italian Mafia. Have you ever felt like you were living someone else's life, hiding who you really are just to find a moment of peace? Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is try to disappear. She pushed the cart toward Lorenzo's private office, grateful for the late hour that meant the halls were empty. Most people feared this place, and rightfully so. Lorenzo Torino controlled half the legitimate businesses in Lower Manhattan and all the illegitimate ones. Men twice her size crossed streets to avoid walking past his building. But Katerina had discovered something these past 3 years that would have shocked anyone who knew her true identity. She felt safer here, invisible in her gray uniform with her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, than she had ever felt in her father's marble palace in Brighton Beach. The office door stood slightly ajar, unusual for this time of night. Lorenzo typically left by 8, headed to one of his restaurants or clubs to conduct the kind of business that happened after dark. Katerina hesitated, her hand tightening on the cart handle. Something felt different tonight, an electricity in the air that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She had inherited her father's instincts for danger, even if she had spent 3 years trying to bury them under the mundane routine of scrubbing floors and replacing light bulbs. She should turn around. Should come back tomorrow when his office was properly empty. But the trash bins needed emptying, and she had learned that drawing attention through broken routines was more dangerous than maintaining her invisible presence. Katerina knocked softly on the door frame and called out her standard greeting. "Hello, Mr. Torino. Just here for cleaning," she said, knowing he wouldn't respond even if he was there. In 3 years, Lorenzo had looked directly at her perhaps a dozen times, and never for longer than it took to nod his acknowledgement of her existence. The office was dark except for the city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Manhattan glittered below like scattered diamonds, and for just a moment Katerina allowed herself to remember what it felt like to belong to something powerful and beautiful. Then she flicked on the desk lamp and began her routine, emptying the waste bins and wiping down surfaces with the methodical precision her father had once demanded from his soldiers. She was reaching behind the massive desk to retrieve a crumpled paper that had missed the bin when her fingertips brushed against something that shouldn't have been there. A small rectangular object taped to the underside of the desk. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the shape and size. A listening device, but not one of Lorenzo's. This was Russian tech, the kind her father's men used for surveillance. Someone else was watching Lorenzo. Someone from her old world. Katerina's hands trembled as she carefully detached the device, her mind racing through possibilities, none of which ended well for her carefully constructed new life. If Lorenzo discovered Russian surveillance in his private office, he would tear apart every person who had access to this room. And if her father's men were watching Lorenzo, it meant the fragile peace between the families was already shattered. She needed to get rid of the device, needed to disappear before anyone realized what she had found. But as she straightened up, clutching the small transmitter in her palm, she realized she was no longer alone. Well. Lorenzo's voice came from the doorway, smooth and deadly as poisoned honey. "What exactly did you just find behind my desk, little mouse?" The device felt like it was burning her palm. Katerina turned slowly, forcing her expression into the confused innocence she had perfected over 3 years of being invisible. "Mr. Torino, I was just cleaning and I found this stuck under your desk. I think maybe someone left it by accident." The lie fell between them like a stone into still water. Lorenzo stepped into the office and closed the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a coffin closing. He was taller than she remembered from their brief encounters, probably 6 feet 2 inches of lean muscle dressed in an expensive charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. His dark hair was styled perfectly despite the late hour, and his green-gray eyes held an intelligence that missed nothing. "You know what that is," he said, moving toward her with the predatory grace of a man comfortable with violence. "And you know it doesn't belong to me." Katerina's father had taught her that the best lies contained threads of truth. I've never seen anything like this before. Should I throw it away? Lorenzo reached her in 3 steps, his hand closing around her wrist with enough pressure to bruise. Let me see your identification. The request hit her like a physical blow. For 3 years, she had carried falsified documents identifying her as Katia Petrov, a Russian immigrant with no family and no connections to anything more dangerous than industrial cleaning supplies. But if Lorenzo was asking for identification, it meant he suspected something was wrong. And if he ran those documents through the right channels, her carefully constructed identity would crumble like tissue paper. Mr. Torino, I don't understand why you need to see my ID. I work for the cleaning service, just like always. His grip tightened, and she saw something cold and calculating flicker behind his eyes. In 3 years, you have never once left a fingerprint in this office. Not on the windows when you clean them. Not on the desk when you dust it. Not on anything. Do you know how unusual that is for a cleaning woman? The observation sent terror shooting down her spine. She had been careful about fingerprints because her prints would flag in every law enforcement database from Moscow to Miami. But she hadn't realized Lorenzo was watching that closely, cataloging details that most people would never notice. I wear gloves when I clean, she said, holding up her latex-covered hands. It's more sanitary. Lorenzo smiled, and the expression was more frightening than his earlier anger. Show me your identification, Katia, or whatever your real name is. Katerina realized with crystalline clarity that her peaceful life was over. 3 years of anonymity, of safety, of pretending to be ordinary, were about to be ripped away. She could feel her father's training reasserting itself, the cold calculation that had been drilled into her since childhood. Fight or flight. Those were the only options when cover was blown. She chose to run. Katerina twisted out of Lorenzo's grip, using a move her father's men had taught her when she was 12. She sprinted toward the door, but Lorenzo was faster than she had expected. His hand caught the back of her uniform shirt, yanking her backward with enough force to send them both stumbling into his desk. The listening device went flying from her palm, skittering across the polished floor to land at the feet of 2 men who had just entered the office. They were clearly Lorenzo's security, big and dangerous in the way that came from years of violence. One of them picked up the device, examining it with professional interest. Russian, the bigger man said, his voice carrying a slight Italian accent. FSB frequency. Military grade. Lorenzo's grip shifted to her shoulders, holding her against his chest while he stared down at the evidence of her deception. His body was warm and solid behind her, and she could feel the controlled tension in his muscles. He was angry, but it was the cold, patient anger of a predator deciding how to kill its prey. So, little mouse, he said, his voice soft against her ear. You want to tell me why you've been planting Russian surveillance devices in my office? Or shall we have this conversation somewhere more private? The threat was unmistakable. Somewhere more private meant a place where screams wouldn't be heard, where blood could be cleaned up without questions. Katerina had grown up in this world. She knew exactly what happened to people who betrayed men like Lorenzo Torino. I didn't plant it, she said, the truth coming out in a desperate rush. I found it. Someone else put it there. Lorenzo's laugh was low and humorless. And you just happened to find it behind my desk? You just happened to know exactly how to remove it without damaging the circuitry? He spun her around to face him, his hands still gripping her shoulders. Up close, she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, could smell his cologne and the faint scent of cigarettes. He was handsome in the dangerous way of men who had never learned to fear consequences, and she found herself cataloging details even as terror raced through her veins. Marcus, he said without taking his eyes off her face. Search her things, and run her fingerprints through the system. I want to know exactly who we're dealing with. The bigger man nodded and disappeared, leaving Katerina alone with Lorenzo and the second guard. The office felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as her carefully constructed world collapsed around her. You have one chance to tell me the truth, Lorenzo said, his thumbs stroking along her collarbones in a gesture that was almost gentle except for the steel in his voice. Who are you? Who sent you? And what exactly have you been reporting about my operations? Katerina closed her eyes, weighing her options. She could confess everything, throw herself on his mercy, and hope that 3 years of perfect service might earn her a quick death, instead of a slow one. She could continue lying and hope her false documents would hold up under scrutiny. Or she could try to contact her father and bring the full weight of the Russian Bratva down on Lorenzo's head. But all of those choices led to violence. Led to war between families that had maintained an uneasy peace for a decade. Led to innocent people dying because she had been foolish enough to believe she could escape her heritage. When she opened her eyes, Lorenzo was studying her face with the intensity of a man reading a battle map. Whatever he saw there made his expression harden. "You're not just some random cleaner, are you?" he said. "You're someone important. Someone worth protecting with 3 years of deep cover." The observation was too accurate, too close to the truth. Katerina felt her last hope of maintaining her cover slip away like water through her fingers. Marcus returned with her purse and the small backpack she kept in the cleaning closet. He dumped the contents of both onto Lorenzo's desk, revealing the mundane possessions of a woman trying to live an ordinary life. Subway cards, cheap makeup, energy bars, a paperback romance novel, and the false identification that had been her lifeline for 3 years. "Run the prints," Lorenzo ordered, picking up her fake ID and studying the photograph. "And check this name through every database we have access to." While they waited, Lorenzo walked to the windows overlooking the city. His silhouette was dark against the glittering lights, and Katerina found herself studying the line of his shoulders, the way he held his head like a man comfortable with command. 3 years of watching him from the shadows had given her insights into his character that his enemies didn't possess. He was ruthless when necessary, but not needlessly cruel. He protected his people fiercely, and he had never once raised his voice to any of the women who worked in his building. It was that last observation that gave her the courage to speak. "Mr. Torino, whatever you decide to do with me, I want you to know that I never reported anything about your business. I never harmed you or your people. I just wanted to disappear." He turned from the window, his expression unreadable. Disappear from what? Before she could answer, Marcus returned with a tablet, his face grim. "Boss, you need to see this." Lorenzo took the device, his eyes scanning whatever information Marcus had found. Katerina watched his expression change from suspicion to shock to something that looked almost like fear. "Katerina Dmitrievna Morozov," he read aloud, his voice carefully controlled. "Daughter of Dmitry Morozov, heir to the largest Russian crime syndicate on the East Coast. Presumed dead in a car explosion 3 years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Katerina felt the weight of her true identity settling around her shoulders like a funeral shroud. There was no going back now. No return to the simple life she had built, scrubbing floors and staying invisible. Lorenzo set down the tablet and walked back to her, stopping just close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "So, princess," he said, the endearment dripping with dangerous mockery, "would you care to explain why the daughter of my biggest rival has been cleaning my toilets for 3 years?" The old Katerina, the one who had been groomed to inherit an empire, would have faced that question with icy composure. But 3 years of freedom had changed her. 3 years of being nobody special had shown her what it felt like to live without the constant weight of expectation and violence. "Because I wanted to be free," she said simply. "Because I wanted to choose my own life instead of inheriting someone else's war." Lorenzo studied her face for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. He had been born into this life, just as she had. He understood the weight of inherited violence. But understanding didn't mean mercy. "Marcus," he said without breaking eye contact with Katerina, "prepare the car. We're going to have a much longer conversation about this, and I prefer to have these kinds of discussions in private." Terror shot through her as she realized what he meant. A private conversation meant the warehouse district. Meant the kind of industrial building where concrete floors could be hosed down and screams wouldn't carry. She had been to such places with her father. She knew what happened in rooms designed for extracting truth from unwilling subjects. "Please," she said, hating the desperation in her voice. "I can disappear again. You'll never see me. I won't tell anyone what I learned here." Lorenzo's smile was sharp as a blade. "Oh, princess, you've learned far too much to just walk away. And your father is going to be very interested to hear that his supposedly dead daughter has been spying on me for 3 years. He was right, and they both knew it. Her father would demand explanations she couldn't give without revealing that she had chosen freedom over family. And Lorenzo couldn't let her leave knowing what she knew about his operations and his security vulnerabilities. She was trapped between two worlds, claimed by neither and trusted by both. The warehouse smelled like rust and old blood, industrial decay mixed with the kind of fear that soaked into concrete and never left. Katerina sat zip-tied to a metal chair in the center of the cavernous space, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the stained floor. She had been here for 6 hours, watching Lorenzo's men prepare for what they clearly expected to be a long and unpleasant conversation. Lorenzo paced in front of her like a caged predator, his expensive suit incongruous in the brutal setting. He had removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle and a small scar that looked like a knife wound. Every few minutes, he would stop and study her face as if trying to solve a puzzle that refused to make sense. 3 years, he said, shaking his head. 3 years you watched me. Learn my routines, my security protocols, my business practices. Do you have any idea what kind of damage you could do with that information? Katerina kept her expression neutral, drawing on years of training and hiding her thoughts. Her father had taught her that showing fear was the same as showing weakness, and weakness invited violence. But inside, terror clawed at her chest with icy fingers. She knew how these interrogations worked, had watched her father conduct them in rooms very much like this one. I told you the truth, she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. I never reported anything to anyone. I just wanted to live a normal life. Lorenzo laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Normal? Princess, your idea of normal was spying on one of the most dangerous men in New York while pretending to be a cleaning woman. That's not normal. That's either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Marcus entered the warehouse carrying a metal briefcase that Katerina recognized with sick certainty. Tools for extracting information from reluctant subjects. Her father owned an identical case, and she had seen its contents used on men who had crossed the Morozov family. Boss, Marcus said, setting the case on a nearby table. We've confirmed her identity through 3 separate sources. She's definitely Dimitri's daughter. The car explosion that supposedly killed her was staged. Professional job, designed to make her disappear completely. Lorenzo stopped pacing and turned to face her fully. So the question becomes, why would Dmitri Morozov's heir fake her own death and spend 3 years cleaning toilets in enemy territory? The answer was too complicated, too personal to explain to a man who held her life in his hands. How could she tell him about the suffocating weight of being groomed to inherit violence? About watching her father order executions before her 16th birthday? About the nightmares that came from knowing she was expected to become a monster? Sometimes people need to escape their families, she said instead. Lorenzo's eyes narrowed. Escape? Or gather intelligence for an eventual takeover? Before she could respond, another of Lorenzo's men entered the warehouse, urgency evident in his quick stride. Boss, we've got a problem. 3 black SUVs just pulled up outside. Russian plates. They're not making any attempt to hide their presence. Katerina felt her heart stop. If her father's men were here, it could only mean one thing. Someone had reported her capture, and Dmitri Morozov was coming to retrieve his supposedly dead daughter. The careful balance of power between the Russian and Italian families was about to shatter in spectacular fashion. Lorenzo's face went pale as he processed the implications. How many men? At least a dozen that we can see, the guard reported. But there could be more in the vehicles. They're armed, and they're not leaving. The sound of approaching engines grew louder, echoing off the warehouse walls like thunder. Katerina closed her eyes, knowing that whatever happened next would destroy the fragile peace she had built over 3 years. Her father wouldn't let this insult stand. Lorenzo couldn't afford to show weakness by releasing her without answers. 2 unstoppable forces were about to collide, and she was trapped in the middle. Lorenzo grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. Did you call them? Did you somehow signal for backup? I've been tied to this chair for 6 hours, she said, meeting his gaze steadily. When exactly would I have called anyone? His jaw tightened as he realized she was right. The arrival of Russian reinforcements was either an impossible coincidence or evidence of surveillance he hadn't detected. Neither option was good for his immediate health. Marcus approached with obvious reluctance. Boss, there are more vehicles arriving. It looks like a full battalion. We're seriously outgunned here. Lorenzo's hand moved to the gun holstered under his jacket, but Katerina could see the calculation in his eyes. His security team numbered maybe 8 men. If the Russians had brought the kind of force Marcus was describing, any fight would be brief and decisive. "You have one chance," Lorenzo said, his voice deadly quiet. "One phone call to tell your people to stand down before this becomes a war nobody wants." Katerina stared at him for a long moment, weighing her options. She could call her father and try to de-escalate the situation, but that would mean revealing she was alive and accepting the consequences of her 3-year deception. She could refuse and let Lorenzo face her father's wrath alone, but innocent people would die in the crossfire. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the warehouse, followed by the distinctive click of weapons being readied. Her father's men were taking positions, preparing for either negotiation or warfare. "Cut my hands free," she said finally, "and give me your phone." Lorenzo hesitated, clearly torn between desperation and suspicion. If this was a trap, if she was somehow orchestrating this entire scenario, releasing her could be signing his death warrant. But if she was telling the truth about wanting to prevent bloodshed, her cooperation might be his only chance of survival. He nodded to Marcus, who approached with a knife and carefully cut through the zip ties. Katerina rubbed her wrists where the plastic had cut into her skin, grateful to have feeling return to her fingers. Lorenzo handed her his phone, his green eyes watching her every movement with predatory intensity. "If you try anything clever," he warned, "you'll be dead before you finish dialing." Katerina took the phone with steady hands, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. She dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years, a direct line that only 5 people in the world possessed. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered in rapid Russian. "Papa," she said simply, using the childhood name she had abandoned when she faked her death. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several heartbeats. When Dmitry Morozov finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of relief, rage, and something that might have been love. "Katya," he said, reverting to the diminutive he had used when she was small. "Where are you?" "I'm safe," she replied in English, wanting Lorenzo to understand the conversation. "But there's been a misunderstanding. The man holding me thought I was a spy." "What man?" Dimitri's voice had gone ice-cold, the tone that preceded executions. "Lorenzo Torino. We're in his warehouse near the docks." "Papa, he didn't know who I was." "This isn't an act of war." She could hear her father's breathing change, becoming deeper and more controlled. The breathing of a man forcing himself to think strategically instead of reacting emotionally. "Put him on the phone," Dmitry commanded. Katerina looked at Lorenzo, who had been following the conversation with obvious tension. "He wants to speak with you." Lorenzo took the phone as if it were a live grenade. "This is Lorenzo Torino." What followed was a conversation in rapid Italian that Katerina couldn't fully follow, but she caught enough words to understand the basic exchange. Her father was explaining exactly who she was and what her capture meant in terms of family honor and international diplomacy. Lorenzo was trying to explain the circumstances without admitting to kidnapping and threatening to torture a crime boss's daughter. The conversation ended abruptly, and Lorenzo handed the phone back to her with a shell-shocked expression. "He's coming in," Lorenzo said to Marcus. "Alone. Tell the men to lower their weapons, but stay alert." 5 minutes later, the warehouse door opened to admit a man Katerina hadn't seen in 3 years, but who haunted her dreams. Dmitry Morozov was 62 years old, silver-haired and elegant in the way of European aristocracy, but his pale blue eyes held the coldness of someone who had ordered more deaths than he could count. He wore a black wool coat over an immaculate suit, and his presence seemed to fill the vast space with dangerous potential. He walked directly to Katerina, ignoring Lorenzo and his men completely. Up close, she could see the lines that 3 years of grief had carved around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. "Malishka," he said softly, using the pet name that meant little one. "I thought you were dead." "I needed to be dead," she replied in Russian. "I needed to be free." Dimitri's face tightened with pain, but he nodded as if he understood. Then he turned to face Lorenzo, and the temperature in the warehouse seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You kidnapped my daughter," he said in accented English. "You tied her to a chair and threatened her life. In my world, such actions require blood payment." Lorenzo squared his shoulders, meeting the older man's gaze steadily. I didn't know who she was. She was using false identification and had been surveilling my operations for 3 years. Any reasonable person would have assumed she was a threat. Dmitri smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than anger would have been. Reasonable, he repeated. Is it reasonable to torture a woman without determining her true identity first? Is it reasonable to threaten execution without considering the consequences? The two men stared at each other across the warehouse floor, and Katerina could feel the weight of history pressing down on the moment. These families had maintained peace through careful negotiation and mutual respect. Her capture had upset that balance in ways that could lead to open warfare. "Papa," she said, drawing both men's attention. He protected his territory. I would have done the same thing in his position. Dimitri's eyebrows rose slightly at her defense of Lorenzo, but he didn't comment on it directly. Instead, he turned back to the Italian crime boss with a new expression of calculation. "My daughter has been living peacefully in your territory for 3 years," he said. "During that time, she has caused no trouble, harmed no one, and apparently provided you with adequate cleaning services. Perhaps we can reach an arrangement that benefits everyone involved." "What kind of arrangement?" Lorenzo asked warily. "You will protect her," Dmitri said simply. "She will remain in your territory, under your protection, and any threat to her will be considered a threat to both our families. In exchange, you will have the friendship of the Morozov organization and our assistance in dealing with mutual enemies." The offer was breathtaking in its implications. An alliance between the Russian and Italian families would create the most powerful criminal organization on the East Coast. But it also meant Lorenzo would be responsible for the safety of a woman he had been prepared to torture and kill hours earlier. "And if I refuse?" Lorenzo asked. Dimitri's smile widened slightly. "Then you will face the consequences of having kidnapped and threatened my daughter. I have 60 men surrounding this building, and more arriving every hour. The choice is yours, but I suggest you choose quickly." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Katerina found herself holding her breath, knowing that the next words spoken would determine whether she lived or died, whether peace or war would define the next chapter of their family's relationship. Lorenzo looked at her for a long moment, his green eyes unreadable. Then he turned back to her father and nodded slowly. "I accept your terms," he said. "Your daughter will have my protection for as long as she remains in my territory." Dmitri extended his hand, and after a brief hesitation, Lorenzo shook it. The gesture sealed an alliance that would reshape the criminal underworld of New York, all because a cleaning woman had been discovered hiding in plain sight. As the two men discussed the details of their new arrangement, Katerina realized that her 3 years of freedom were over. She was once again a valuable piece on the chessboard of family politics, a symbol of alliance between two powerful men. But perhaps, if she was clever enough, she could find a way to turn her new position into something resembling the life she actually wanted. The game was changing, and for the first time in years, Katerina Morozov was ready to play. The ride back to Lorenzo's penthouse was conducted in suffocating silence, both of them acutely aware that everything had changed in the space of a few hours. Katerina sat in the passenger seat of his black Mercedes, watching the city lights blur past while trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. She was no longer Katya Petrov, invisible cleaning woman. She was Katerina Morozov, protected asset in a dangerous political alliance, trapped once again in the world she had spent 3 years trying to escape. Lorenzo drove with the controlled precision of a man accustomed to making life-or-death decisions, his hands steady on the wheel despite the tension radiating from his shoulders. Every few minutes, she caught him glancing at her in his peripheral vision, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. The woman who had scrubbed his floors and emptied his trash cans was the daughter of his most dangerous rival, and now he was responsible for keeping her alive. When they reached his building, the doorman's eyes widened slightly at seeing them together, but he was too well trained to comment on the unusual sight of the building's cleaning woman arriving in the boss's personal vehicle. The elevator ride to the 52nd floor felt endless, filled with the kind of awkward awareness that came from two people who had been strangers hours before and were now bound together by circumstances neither had chosen. Lorenzo's penthouse was exactly as she remembered from her cleaning duties, all modern lines and expensive materials designed to impress and intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, and the furniture was the kind of sleek Italian design that cost more than most people's annual salaries. But now she wasn't here to dust and vacuum. She was here as a guest, a protected person, a living symbol of an alliance that could reshape the criminal landscape of New York. So, Lorenzo said, closing the door behind them and engaging the electronic locks, I suppose we should discuss the arrangements. Katerina turned to face him, noting how different he looked in his own space. Less predatory, more human. The warehouse had been his hunting ground, but here in his home, she could see glimpses of the man beneath the dangerous reputation. Books lined one wall, mostly history and philosophy, suggesting an intelligence that went beyond mere street cunning. A chess set sat on a side table, the pieces arranged in what looked like an ongoing game against himself. What kind of arrangements? She asked, though she suspected she already knew. Your father was very specific about the terms of our agreement, Lorenzo replied, loosening his tie and rolling up his sleeves. You're to be under my direct protection, which means you can't leave this building without an escort. You can't contact anyone from your old life without clearance. And any threat to you will be considered an act of war against both families. The words hit her like physical blows. She had traded one cage for another, exchanging her father's palace in Brighton Beach for Lorenzo's tower in Manhattan. The only difference was the bars were now made of political necessity instead of family obligation. For how long? She asked quietly. Until your father and I determine the alliance is stable enough that you won't be targeted as a way to undermine our agreement, Lorenzo said. Could be months. Could be years. Katerina walked to the windows, pressing her palm against the cool glass and staring out at the city that had been her sanctuary for 3 years. Somewhere out there was the small studio apartment where she had learned to live as an ordinary person, where she had fallen asleep to the sounds of traffic instead of gunfire, where she had discovered what it felt like to be nobody special. I had a life, she said, not bothering to hide the bitterness in her voice. A small, quiet life where nobody expected me to be anything other than competent at my job. I had friends who didn't know my last name could get them killed. I had peace. Lorenzo moved to stand beside her at the window, and she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Up close, she could see that his eyes weren't just green, but had flecks of gold that caught the city lights. His cologne was subtle and expensive, sandalwood and bergamot that probably cost more per ounce than she used to make in a week. Peace, he repeated thoughtfully. I remember what that felt like. Before I inherited this empire, before every decision I make affects hundreds of people and their families. Sometimes I think about what it would be like to disappear, to become someone ordinary. The admission surprised her. She had spent 3 years observing him from the shadows, noting his routines and his careful control, but she had never considered that he might be as trapped by his position as she was by hers. Why don't you? She asked, turning to study his profile. You have enough money to disappear anywhere in the world. Why stay and carry the weight of an empire you didn't choose? Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the lights below. Because hundreds of people depend on me for their livelihoods, their protection, their futures. Because walking away would create a power vacuum that would tear this city apart. Because sometimes duty matters more than personal happiness. The words resonated with painful familiarity. How many times had her father said something similar when she questioned the violence and corruption that surrounded their family? How many times had she been told that personal desires were selfish luxuries they couldn't afford? Your room is down the hall, Lorenzo said, gesturing toward the guest wing. It has its own bathroom and sitting area. I've had clothes sent up in your size, basic necessities. If you need anything else, just ask. Katerina followed him down a hallway lined with original artwork, her bare feet silent on the polished hardwood floors. The guest room was larger than her entire studio apartment had been, decorated in soothing blues and grays with another wall of windows overlooking the city. A king-sized bed dominated the space, dressed in Egyptian cotton that probably cost more than her monthly rent. There are tablets and books if you get bored, Lorenzo continued, opening a closet to reveal an array of designer clothes in her exact size. My housekeeper stocked the bathroom with everything you might need. The kitchen is always available if you're hungry. He paused in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame as he looked back at her. For what it's worth, I'm sorry about earlier. About the warehouse and the threats. I didn't know who you were. But you would have done the same thing even if you had known, Katerina said. It wasn't a question. Lorenzo's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't deny it. Probably. In this business, you don't survive by taking chances with security breaches. She nodded, appreciating his honesty even if she didn't like it. At least he wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't. They were both products of a violent world, shaped by the necessity of survival and the weight of inherited responsibilities. After he left, Katerina explored her temporary prison with the thoroughness her father had trained into her. The windows were bulletproof but could be opened for fresh air. The room had no obvious surveillance equipment, though she was certain Lorenzo's security system monitored everything. The clothes in the closet were expensive but practical, selected by someone who understood the difference between designer fashion and functional luxury. She showered in the marble bathroom, washing away the last remnants of her 3-year masquerade as Katya Petrov. The hot water felt like a baptism, stripping away the careful humility and invisibility she had cultivated in favor of the confidence that came with her true name. When she emerged, she chose black silk pajamas that felt like armor against the vulnerability of her situation. Sleep proved elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lorenzo's face in the warehouse, the cold calculation in his green eyes as he decided whether she was worth keeping alive. But she also remembered the way he had looked at her in his penthouse, the hint of understanding when she talked about wanting peace, the careful gentleness in his voice when he apologized. She was still awake when she heard the front door open and close around 3 in the morning. Lorenzo's voice carried down the hallway as he spoke to someone, probably Marcus giving him a security briefing. The sound of his presence was oddly comforting, a reminder that she was protected even if she was also trapped. The next morning, she found him in the kitchen making coffee with the kind of focused attention most people reserved for important tasks. He had changed into dark jeans and a black sweater that clung to his shoulders and emphasized the lean strength of his build. His hair was slightly damp from a recent shower, and he looked younger without the formal armor of his business suits. "Good morning," he said, glancing up from the espresso machine. "I wasn't sure what you preferred, so I made both espresso and American coffee." The gesture was unexpectedly thoughtful. Katerina accepted a cup of the espresso, inhaling the rich aroma that reminded her of mornings in her father's house before everything became complicated by politics and violence. "Thank you," she said, settling onto a bar stool at the kitchen island. "This is perfect." They sat in silence for several minutes, both seemingly unsure how to navigate their new relationship. She was no longer his employee, but she wasn't exactly his guest either. She was something unprecedented, a protected asset who was also the daughter of his new ally, and a woman he found increasingly difficult to ignore. "I have meetings this morning," Lorenzo said finally. "Marcus will be here if you need anything, and there are additional security measures in place. The building is safe, but I prefer you didn't wander around without letting someone know where you're going." Katerina nodded, understanding the precautions even if she resented the necessity. They were both adapting to a situation neither had anticipated, trying to establish boundaries and routines that would allow them to coexist without stepping on the dangerous ground of their complicated past. The day passed slowly. She read. She watched the city from her windows. She explored the penthouse with the careful attention of someone mapping potential escape routes and defensive positions. Lorenzo returned in the late afternoon with tension written across his shoulders and a small cut on his cheekbone that suggested his meetings had involved more than conversation. "What happened?" she asked before she could stop herself. Lorenzo paused in the act of loosening his tie, surprised by her concern. "Some of our competitors are testing the new alliance. Nothing serious, just probing for weaknesses." Katerina moved closer, studying the cut with professional interest. It looked like it came from broken glass rather than a blade, probably from a bar fight or thrown bottle. Without thinking, she reached up to examine the wound, her fingers gentle against his skin. "You should clean this properly," she said. "It could get infected." Lorenzo went very still under her touch, his breathing shallow as she traced the edge of the cut with careful fingers. This close, she could see the faint lines around his eyes, the small scar on his jaw that looked old and well-healed. the way his pupils dilated when she met his gaze. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice was rougher than usual. Katerina realized she was still touching his face, her palm resting against his cheek, while her thumb brushed the corner of the cut. The moment stretched between them, filled with an awareness that had nothing to do with medical concern and everything to do with the magnetic pull she had been trying to ignore since the warehouse. She should step back, should maintain the professional distance that would keep them both safe from complications that could destroy the fragile alliance between their families. But Lorenzo's skin was warm under her palm, and his eyes were dark with something that looked like hunger, and she found herself leaning closer instead of pulling away. The sound of the elevator arriving broke the spell. Lorenzo stepped back just as Marcus emerged, his timing impeccable and probably deliberate. The security chief took one look at their positions and carefully kept his expression neutral. "Boss," Marcus said, "we've got the reports from today's incidents. 3 separate probes, all from the Castellano family. They're definitely testing our response time and coordination with the Russians." Lorenzo nodded, his professional mask sliding back into place with practiced ease. "Any casualties?" "2 of theirs, none of ours. The Russians were fast and efficient." Message sent and received. As the 2 men discussed security protocols and defensive strategies, Katerina retreated to her room to process what had just happened. The moment of connection in the kitchen had been unexpected and dangerous, a glimpse of possibility that could complicate everything they were trying to build. But late that night, as she lay awake listening to the sounds of the city below, she found herself remembering the way Lorenzo's eyes had darkened when she touched his face, the careful control in his voice when he said he was fine. For 3 years, she had been invisible to him. Now she was suddenly very visible indeed, and the intensity of his attention was both thrilling and terrifying. The alliance between their families was supposed to protect her. But as she drifted off to sleep, Katerina wondered who was going to protect her from the growing attraction to the man who had once been prepared to kill her and was now responsible for keeping her alive. 3 days into their new arrangement, Katerina found Lorenzo on the roof terrace at 2 in the morning, standing at the railing with a glass of whiskey and the weight of the world on his shoulders. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the city stretched out below them like a circuit board of lights and possibilities. She had been unable to sleep, restless with the strange combination of safety and captivity that defined her new existence. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, stepping out onto the terrace and wrapping her silk robe tighter against the chill. Lorenzo turned at the sound of her voice, and she saw exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes. He had been working 18-hour days since the alliance was announced, managing the delicate politics of integrating Russian and Italian operations while fending off challenges from rival families who saw the partnership as either a threat or an opportunity. "Too much to think about," he said, offering her his glass. "The Castellanos made another move today. Hit one of our shipments coming in from Sicily. Your father's men eliminated the threat, but it's escalating faster than I anticipated." Katerina accepted the whiskey, letting the expensive liquor burn away the taste of her own sleepless anxiety. She had grown up in this world of calculated violence and political maneuvering, but 3 years of peace had made her forget how exhausting it was to live under constant threat. "They're testing the strength of the alliance," she said, settling onto the cushioned seating area that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan. "Seeing if you and my father will actually coordinate defense or if this is just a paper agreement." Lorenzo joined her on the sofa, leaving careful space between them even as his attention focused on her with the intensity that had become familiar over the past few days. "Smart. What would you do in their position?" The question surprised her. Lorenzo had been treating her with polite deference since the warehouse incident, but this was the first time he had asked for her strategic opinion as if she were an equal rather than a protected asset. Katerina considered the problem with the analytical mind her father had trained into her before she decided to disappear. "I'd target the money," she said finally. "Shipments can be replaced, but if they disrupt the financial integration between our organizations, they force us to choose between protecting assets and maintaining alliance. Divide and conquer through economic pressure." Lorenzo nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That's exactly what I would do, and it's probably what they're planning next." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, sharing the whiskey and the strange intimacy of two insomniacs finding solace in each other's company. The city noise was muted at this height, creating a bubble of peace that felt separate from the dangerous world below. "Can I ask you something?" Lorenzo said, his voice careful and neutral. Katerina nodded, curious about what had been weighing on his mind during their days of cautious cohabitation. "Why did you really disappear? I understand wanting freedom from family expectations, but faking your death is extreme even for someone trying to escape. What happened that made you willing to give up everything?" The question hit deeper than she had expected. No one had ever asked her to explain her choice, to justify the decision that had cost her 3 years of hiding and ultimately led to this moment. Her father had simply accepted her return. Lorenzo had accepted her presence, but neither had asked her to account for the years of deception. "I killed someone when I was 19, she said quietly, the words falling between them like stones into still water. Lorenzo went very still beside her, his attention sharpening with the predatory focus she had seen in the warehouse. "Who?" "My mother's murderer," Katerina continued, staring out at the lights below rather than meeting his gaze. "A rival family's enforcer who thought killing Dmitry Morozov's wife would send a message about territorial boundaries. My father wanted justice, but he also wanted it handled through proper channels, political negotiations that would maintain the balance of power." "And you disagreed," Lorenzo said, understanding evident in his voice. "I was 19 and angry and tired of watching evil people escape consequences through diplomatic immunity. So I followed the enforcer home one night, put a bullet in his head, and left his body on his boss's doorstep with a note explaining exactly why he died." The memory still carried weight, even after all these years. She could still remember the feel of the gun in her hand, the way her heart had raced as she waited in the shadows for her target, the strange mixture of satisfaction and horror that had filled her as she watched him fall. "The retaliation was swift and brutal," Katerina continued. 3 families united against us, demanding blood payment for the insult. My father faced a choice between starting a war that would have destroyed half of New York's criminal infrastructure or sacrificing his daughter to maintain peace. "So you sacrificed yourself instead," Lorenzo said softly. "I chose to disappear rather than watch innocent people die for my anger. The car explosion was my idea, a way to give both sides what they needed. The other families got justice for the insult. My father got to keep his heir technically alive, and I got to find out what it felt like to be nobody special." Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of her story. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a new understanding of who she really was beneath the careful facade. "You were protecting your family the same way I protect mine, making the hard choice that costs you everything but saves everyone else." The observation was more accurate than she had expected. Lorenzo understood the weight of inherited responsibility, the way love and duty could force someone to sacrifice their own happiness for the greater good. "What about you?" she asked, turning to study his profile in the moonlight. "You said you inherited this empire. What happened to make a philosophy student become a crime boss?" Lorenzo's laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. "How did you know about the philosophy?" "Your books. The way you think about problems strategically rather than just tactically. You analyze motivations and long-term consequences like someone trained in ethical reasoning." Lorenzo took the whiskey back from her, draining the last of the expensive liquid before setting the glass aside. "My father was killed when I was 22. Car bomb outside his favorite restaurant, very public and very bloody. I was supposed to be with him, but I had stayed late at Columbia finishing a paper on Machiavelli and the nature of political power. The irony is devastating," Katerina said quietly. Lorenzo nodded, his jaw tight with old pain. "I found out later that the bomb was meant for both of us. The Bratva wanted to eliminate the entire Torino line and absorb our territory. Instead, they created a very angry graduate student with a trust fund and a burning desire for revenge. What did you do?" "I dropped out of school, learned everything my father had tried to protect me from, and spent 3 years systematically destroying everyone involved in his murder. By the time I was finished, I was exactly what they had tried to kill, but I was also trapped in a world I had never wanted to join." The parallel between their stories was striking. Both of them had been forced into violence by circumstances beyond their control. Both had made choices that transformed them into people they hadn't planned to become. Both carried the weight of inherited responsibility that demanded constant sacrifice. "Do you ever regret it?" Katerina asked. "The revenge, the empire, the life you built from anger?" "Every day," Lorenzo admitted. "But regret doesn't change the reality that hundreds of people depend on me now. I can't undo the choices I made any more than you can undo yours." Before Katerina could respond, the sound of breaking glass echoed from somewhere below, followed immediately by the distinctive crack of gunfire. Lorenzo was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the weapon concealed under his sweater as his entire demeanor shifted from contemplative to lethal. "Stay behind me," he commanded, moving toward the terrace door with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to violence. Katerina followed him inside, her own training reasserting itself as adrenaline flooded her system. The penthouse was dark except for the city lights streaming through the windows, but she could hear movement in the lower level, the careful footsteps of people trying to move silently through an unfamiliar space. "How many?" she whispered, pressing close to Lorenzo's back as they moved down the hallway toward his bedroom. "At least 4, he replied, pulling a second gun from a hidden drawer and offering it to her. "Maybe more." They came up through the service elevator, which means they have inside knowledge of the building's security. Katerina checked the weapon with automatic competence, her father's training taking over despite 3 years of deliberately avoiding violence. The gun was a compact Glock, perfectly balanced and recently cleaned. Lorenzo had armed her without hesitation, trusting her to watch his back despite everything that had happened between them. The intruders were professionals, moving through the penthouse with tactical precision and night vision equipment that gave them an advantage in the darkness. But they hadn't counted on facing 2 people trained from childhood in the art of survival, 2 people who had spent days learning each other's movements and rhythms. Lorenzo gestured toward the kitchen, indicating that he would take point while she covered their flank. Katerina nodded, understanding the plan without needing verbal communication. They moved together with the synchronized grace of dancers, each anticipating the other's movements in ways that spoke of natural compatibility. The first attacker emerged from the living room just as Lorenzo reached the kitchen threshold. The gunfight was brief and decisive, over in seconds as Lorenzo put 2 rounds center mass, while Katerina eliminated the threat coming from the opposite direction. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of their synchronized breathing and the distant wail of sirens approaching. 3 more, Lorenzo said quietly, reloading with practiced efficiency. "They'll try to flank us through the guest wing." He was right. The remaining attackers had regrouped, using the chaos of the initial engagement to reposition themselves for a coordinated assault. But Katerina had grown up playing war games in her father's compound, learning to think like both hunter and prey, and she could hear the subtle sounds of movement that indicated their opponent's locations. She caught Lorenzo's attention and pointed toward the ceiling, then held up 3 fingers to indicate the number of targets. He nodded, understanding immediately that she could track their movements through sound alone. Together, they repositioned themselves to create a crossfire that would force the attackers into an untenable position. The final confrontation lasted less than a minute. When it was over, 5 bodies lay scattered across Lorenzo's penthouse, and the air was thick with cordite and the metallic scent of blood. Neither Lorenzo nor Katerina had sustained serious injury, though her silk pajamas were ruined and his sweater had bullet holes that spoke of how close several rounds had come to finding their mark. "Are you hurt?" Lorenzo asked, holstering his weapon and moving to check her for injuries with gentle hands that shook slightly from adrenaline. "I'm fine," she assured him, though she was trembling from the aftershock of violence and the realization of how close they had both come to death. Lorenzo's hands stilled on her shoulders, his green eyes dark with something that went beyond relief at their survival. They had just fought together as partners, trusting each other with their lives in ways that went far beyond the political alliance between their families. The connection she had been trying to ignore was now impossible to deny. "Katia," he said softly, using the diminutive her father had called her, his thumb stroking along her collarbones where her pulse was racing from more than fear. She looked up at him, seeing her own recognition reflected in his eyes. The careful distance they had been maintaining was no longer sustainable. They were bound together now by shared violence and mutual trust, by the intimate knowledge that they could depend on each other when everything else fell apart. When he kissed her, it was with the desperate hunger of someone who had just faced death and found life more precious than before. Katerina responded with equal intensity, her hands fisting in his sweater as she pulled him closer, needing to feel the solid warmth of him as proof that they were both still alive. The kiss deepened, fueled by adrenaline and longing and the sudden understanding that they had both been fighting attraction for days without admitting it to themselves or each other. Lorenzo's hands tangled in her hair, angling her head to deepen the connection while she pressed herself against the solid strength of his chest. "We should stop," he said against her lips, though his actions contradicted his words as he traced the line of her throat with gentle kisses. "Why?" she asked, arching her neck to give him better access while her fingers worked at the buttons of his shirt. "Because you're under my protection. Because this complicates everything. Because once we cross this line, there's no going back to the way things were." Katerina pulled back just enough to meet his eyes, seeing the conflict between desire and duty that she understood all too well. "Good," she said simply. "I don't want to go back." The words seemed to break whatever restraint he had been clinging to. Lorenzo lifted her into his arms, carrying her to his bedroom with the careful reverence of someone handling something infinitely precious. He set her down beside his king-sized bed, his hands trembling slightly as he traced the silk of her pajama top. "Are you sure?" he asked, giving her one last chance to retreat from the precipice they were approaching. Instead of answering with words, Katerina began unbuttoning his shirt, her fingers steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to do. She had spent 3 years learning to trust her own desires instead of inherited obligations, and right now she desired nothing more than to be with this complicated, dangerous, surprisingly gentle man who had somehow become essential to her sense of safety and belonging. What followed was a slow exploration of mutual need and carefully unveiled vulnerability. Lorenzo made love to her with the thorough attention he brought to everything important in his life, learning the geography of her body with patient hands and reverent kisses. Katerina discovered that beneath his careful control lay a capacity for tenderness that took her breath away, a gentleness that made her feel precious rather than conquered. Afterward, they lay entwined in his bed, her head resting on his chest while his fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. The penthouse was quiet except for the distant sounds of police sirens and the steady rhythm of Lorenzo's heartbeat beneath her ear. "What happens now?" she asked, though she was almost afraid to hear the answer. "Now we deal with the consequences," Lorenzo said softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Your father will want a full report on tonight's attack. The police will need to be managed. The other families will see this as either a sign of weakness or strength depending on how we present it. And us?" she pressed, needing to know whether what had just happened was a moment of crisis-induced passion or something deeper and more lasting. Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment, his hand stilling on her shoulder as he considered the question. "Us is the most dangerous and most important thing that's happened to me in years," he said finally. "And I have no idea how we make it work without destroying everything else." Katerina smiled against his chest, relieved that she wasn't the only one feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of their connection. They would figure it out together, one day at a time, because the alternative was losing something that had already become essential to her happiness. As dawn broke over the city, casting golden light through the windows of Lorenzo's bedroom, Katerina realized that she had finally found what she had been searching for during her 3 years of hiding. Not freedom from her family's world, but a way to be herself within it, protected and cherished by someone who understood the weight she carried and was strong enough to help her bear it. The intelligence arrived at dawn, delivered by one of Dimitri's lieutenants who had been tracking communications between rival families for weeks. Katerina stood in Lorenzo's kitchen wearing one of his shirts over her silk pajamas, watching him read the decoded messages with growing tension etched across his features. The attack on his penthouse hadn't been random or opportunistic. It had been a coordinated probe, testing their defenses before the real assault. "How long do we have?" she asked, though she could already read the answer in the grim set of his shoulders. 6 hours, maybe less, Lorenzo replied, setting down the tablet with careful control. 5 families have coordinated a simultaneous strike. They're targeting your father's shipments in Brooklyn, my operations in Queens, and both of us specifically. They want to eliminate the alliance by eliminating the people who forged it. Katerina felt the familiar chill of calculated violence, the cold assessment that came from growing up in a world where politics and murder were often the same thing. She had spent 3 years trying to escape this reality, but now she was grateful for the training that allowed her to think strategically even as adrenaline flooded her system. Marcus entered the kitchen with 2 additional security personnel, all of them armed and wearing the grim expressions of men preparing for war. "Boss, we've got extraction vehicles ready. We can have you both out of the city within the hour. There's a safe house in Montreal that even the Russians don't know about." Lorenzo looked at Katerina, and she could see the calculation behind his green eyes. Fleeing would be the smart choice, the safe choice. They could disappear together, let their lieutenants handle the immediate crisis while they rebuilt their strength from a position of safety. But running would also mean abandoning hundreds of people who depended on them, leaving their organizations vulnerable to dismantlement and absorption by enemies. "No," Katerina said before Lorenzo could respond. "If we run, they win. They destroy both families and prove that the alliance was built on fear rather than strength." Lorenzo's expression shifted to something that looked like pride mixed with concern. "Running keeps you alive. Fighting puts you directly in the line of fire. I didn't spend 3 years learning to live as Katia Petrov just to die as a coward," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Besides, you'll need someone who knows Russian tactical protocols if we're coordinating with my father's forces." The truth was more complex than tactical necessity. Somewhere over the past few days, Lorenzo's safety had become as important to her as her own. The thought of him facing this threat alone while she hid in safety was unacceptable. They had found something worth protecting in each other, and she refused to let fear destroy it before they had a chance to explore what it could become. Lorenzo nodded slowly, understanding and accepting her choice even as worry flickered in his eyes. "Then we coordinate defense. Your father's forces take the Brooklyn assault, my people handle Queens, and we eliminate the leadership before they can regroup." The warehouse they chose for the final confrontation was neutral territory, a sprawling complex on the border between Russian and Italian areas that offered multiple escape routes and defensive positions. Katerina stood beside Lorenzo in the makeshift command center, watching tactical displays that showed enemy forces converging from 5 different directions. 60 men armed with military-grade weapons, supported by vehicles and communications equipment that suggested significant financial backing. "They're not just trying to eliminate us," she observed, studying the attack patterns. "They're trying to start a war between our families by making it look like betrayal from within." Lorenzo followed her reasoning immediately. If enough confusion and casualties occurred during the joint operation, both sides will assume the other family set them up. Brilliant and vicious. The first wave hit at exactly 4 in the afternoon, just as intelligence had predicted. Automatic weapons fire shattered the afternoon quiet as attackers moved to surround the warehouse complex. But instead of the defensive confusion they expected, they encountered coordinated resistance that spoke of professional military planning. Katerina found herself fighting alongside men she had never met, but who followed her tactical suggestions without question because her father had vouched for her competence. She moved through the warehouse with deadly efficiency, using skills she had hoped never to need again, eliminating threats with the cold precision her father had drilled into her before she learned to hate what those skills represented. Lorenzo fought like someone who had spent years earning his reputation through violence rather than inheriting it through birthright. She watched him coordinate defensive positions while simultaneously engaging targets, his calm commands keeping his men focused even as bullets shattered concrete around them. The turning point came when enemy reinforcements arrived simultaneously from 3 directions, threatening to overwhelm their defensive perimeter through sheer numbers. Katerina saw the tactical problem developing and made a split-second decision that would either save them all or get them killed. "Cover me," she called to Lorenzo, sprinting toward a stack of shipping containers that would give her a clear sight line to the approaching vehicles. "Katia, no?" Lorenzo's voice carried desperation as he realized what she was planning. But she was already moving, using the cover fire from Russian and Italian shooters to reach the elevated position that would let her coordinate the defensive collapse they needed. From the top of the containers, she could see the entire battle developing, could direct their forces to create the crossfire that would trap the attackers in an inescapable killing field. She was calling out targeting instructions in rapid Russian and Italian when she saw the sniper's muzzle flash from a building across the street. Time seemed to slow as she calculated trajectory and realized the shot was aimed directly at Lorenzo's position. Without thinking, she screamed his name while launching herself from the containers toward where he stood coordinating the defense. The bullet that would have killed Lorenzo caught her in the shoulder instead, spinning her around and sending her tumbling to the warehouse floor with blood spreading across her borrowed tactical vest. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but through it she could hear Lorenzo's roar of fury as he saw her fall. What happened next would be talked about in criminal circles for years afterward. Lorenzo Torino, known for his calculated approach to violence, abandoned all strategic thinking in favor of pure rage. He moved through the warehouse like an avenging angel, eliminating threats with methodical brutality while screaming orders that turned defensive positioning into aggressive assault. Katerina, fighting to remain conscious through blood loss and shock, watched her father's men respond to Lorenzo's commands as if he were family, their loyalty transferring seamlessly to the man who was willing to die protecting Dimitri's daughter. The coordination between Russian and Italian forces became seamless, united by shared purpose and mutual respect earned through combat. The battle ended with enemy forces either dead or fleeing, their coordinated assault shattered by the very unity they had been trying to destroy. As sirens approached in the distance, Lorenzo knelt beside Katerina on the blood-stained concrete, his hands gentle despite the violence he had just unleashed. "Stay with me," he said, pressing his jacket against her shoulder wound while his eyes searched her face for signs of consciousness. "You don't get to sacrifice yourself for me and then leave me to live with it." Katerina managed a weak smile despite the pain radiating through her entire body. "Someone had to save the man I love," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Lorenzo's expression shifted to something that looked like wonder mixed with terror. "You love me?" "Apparently so," she replied, her voice growing weaker as adrenaline faded and shock set in. Inconvenient timing for the revelation. Lorenzo pressed his lips to her forehead, his voice rough with emotion when he spoke. "I love you too. Which is why you're going to survive this, so we can have a proper conversation about how insane we both are." The ambulance arrived with a police escort, followed closely by Dmitry Morozov and what looked like half of his organization. Katerina watched through fading consciousness as her father surveyed the warehouse battlefield, taking in the evidence of coordination between his forces and Lorenzo's men, the proof that the alliance had been tested under fire and emerged stronger. She did well, Lorenzo told Dmitry as paramedics loaded her onto a stretcher. "Your daughter fights like a warrior and thinks like a general. She saved all of us today." Dimitri's pale eyes studied Lorenzo for a long moment, reading something in the younger man's expression that seemed to satisfy him. "Then keep her safe while she heals," he said simply. "She has chosen you, and I have learned to trust her judgment." As the ambulance pulled away with Lorenzo holding her hand, Katerina realized that the 3 years she had spent running from her family's world had led her exactly where she needed to be. Not free from violence and responsibility, but standing beside someone strong enough to share the weight. Someone who understood that love in their world required the willingness to sacrifice everything for the person who mattered most. The war was over. The alliance had proven itself through fire. And somehow, against all odds, she had found a way to be both Katerina Morozov and the woman she had chosen to become. The future stretched ahead of them, dangerous but no longer lonely, filled with the promise of building something beautiful from the ashes of everything that had tried to destroy them. 6 months later, Katerina Morozov stood in the penthouse office that now served as headquarters for the most powerful criminal alliance on the East Coast, watching Lorenzo conduct a video conference with shipping executives in 3 different countries. Her shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a thin scar that she wore like a badge of honor, proof that love sometimes required the willingness to take bullets for the person who mattered most. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the space they had transformed from Lorenzo's private domain into a joint command center that seamlessly blended Russian efficiency with Italian style. Maps covered one wall, marked with shipping routes and territory boundaries that represented billions in legitimate revenue flowing through carefully constructed business partnerships. The violence was still there, would always be there in their world, but it was contained now within the framework of an alliance that had proven stronger than anyone had dared to hope. Lorenzo finished his call and turned to face her with the smile that had become as essential to her happiness as breathing. His morning routine now included bringing her espresso prepared exactly as she preferred it, a small ritual of care that spoke to the domestic intimacy they had built alongside their professional partnership. The Port Authority approved the expansion, he said, crossing the office to hand her the steaming cup. We'll have exclusive access to the 3 largest piers in Brooklyn by the end of the month. Your father's shipping connections and my distribution network will control 60% of East Coast imports within a year. Katerina accepted the coffee with the kind of automatic gratitude that came from 6 months of being cherished by someone who paid attention to the smallest details of her comfort. All legitimate business, of course, she said with the slight smile that acknowledged the careful fiction they maintained for legal purposes. Of course, Lorenzo agreed, settling beside her on the leather sofa that faced their wall of tactical displays. Though I suspect the Coast Guard will be disappointed by how efficiently our operations run compared to our competitors. The alliance had exceeded every expectation. Russian organizational discipline combined with Italian political connections had created a business empire that dominated everything it touched while maintaining the kind of legal insulation that government investigators found almost impossible to penetrate. More importantly, the partnership had brought peace to territories that had been locked in territorial warfare for decades. Dmitri entered the office without knocking, a privilege he had claimed since the warehouse battle that had cemented his respect for Lorenzo's devotion to protecting Katerina. At 62, her father carried himself with the elegant authority of European aristocracy, but his pale eyes had warmed considerably when dealing with the man who had proven worthy of his daughter's love. The wedding preparations are complete, Dmitri announced, settling into the chair that had become his unofficial seat during morning strategy meetings. The cathedral in Brighton Beach for the Russian ceremony, the vineyard in Sicily for the Italian celebration. 2 weeks of festivities that will announce to every family from Moscow to Naples that this alliance is permanent. Katerina still marveled at how naturally her father had accepted Lorenzo as family, treating him with the respect typically reserved for blood relatives and trusted lieutenants. The warehouse battle had eliminated any doubts about Lorenzo's commitment to protecting what mattered to Dmitri most, and 6 months of successful partnership had proven his strategic value beyond question. Any word from the Castellanos? Lorenzo asked, referring to the only family that had survived the coordinated assault relatively intact. They've requested a meeting, Dmitri replied with satisfaction. Apparently, watching their allies get eliminated while our profits increased has convinced them that cooperation might be more profitable than competition. They want to discuss territory sharing and mutual protection agreements. The transformation was remarkable. 6 months earlier, Lorenzo had been an isolated crime boss managing constant territorial threats, while Katerina lived in hiding from the violence of her birthright. Now they commanded an empire built on mutual respect and strategic thinking rather than fear and brutality. Lorenzo's hand found hers automatically, their fingers intertwining with the unconscious intimacy of people who had learned to depend on each other completely. The gesture was small but significant, proof that they had found a way to be both powerful leaders and devoted partners without sacrificing either role. There's something else we need to discuss, Katerina said, her voice carefully neutral despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. Something that will affect our long-term planning. Both men turned their attention to her with the focused intensity that had become familiar during business discussions. But this wasn't business, not exactly. This was the kind of personal development that would reshape everything they were building together. I'm pregnant, she said simply, watching their faces change as the implications registered. Dmitri's expression shifted to wonder and delight, the kind of joy that came from unexpected gifts after years of believing such possibilities were lost. Lorenzo went very still beside her, his hand tightening on hers as he processed the news that would transform him from crime boss to father, from protector of an empire to guardian of their future. How long have you known? Lorenzo asked, his voice rough with emotion. 3 weeks, Katerina admitted. I wanted to be certain before I changed all our security protocols and succession planning. The practical concerns were immediate and significant. Pregnancy in their world meant increased vulnerability, the need for additional protection measures, and careful consideration of which operations required Hansen management versus remote oversight. But beneath the tactical planning, she could see deeper emotions playing across Lorenzo's face. "You're happy about this?" he asked, needing confirmation that she viewed their child as a blessing rather than a complication. Katerina turned to face him fully, letting him see the joy she had been careful to contain until this moment. "I'm terrified and thrilled and completely overwhelmed by the idea of bringing a child into this world," she said honestly. "But yes, I'm happy. This baby will grow up knowing they're wanted and protected and loved by two families who will move heaven and earth to keep them safe." Lorenzo's smile was radiant as he lifted her hand to press a kiss to her knuckles. "Then we'd better make sure we build something worth inheriting." The months that followed were a whirlwind of wedding preparations and business expansion, of learning to navigate pregnancy while managing an empire that demanded constant attention and strategic thinking. Katerina discovered that being Lorenzo's partner rather than his protected asset meant sharing not just the benefits of power, but the weight of responsibility for hundreds of people's livelihoods and safety. Their wedding was magnificent, a celebration that lasted 2 weeks and spanned 2 continents as they honored both cultural traditions while creating something uniquely their own. The cathedral in Brighton Beach overflowed with Russian nobility and American crime families, while the vineyard ceremony in Sicily brought together Italian aristocracy and international business leaders in a display of alliance that sent clear messages about the new balance of power. But the moment that mattered most to Katerina came during a quiet evening in their penthouse, 3 weeks after their return from Sicily. She was reviewing shipping manifests while Lorenzo handled coordination with their European partners, the kind of companionable work that had become their preferred way of spending time together. "Do you ever miss it?" Lorenzo asked during a break in his calls. "The simple life you built as Katya Petrov?" Katerina considered the question seriously, thinking about the woman who had scrubbed floors and remained invisible, who had found peace in anonymity and ordinary routines. That life had given her 3 years of safety and the chance to discover who she was beneath inherited expectations. But it had also been incomplete, a temporary refuge rather than a permanent solution. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," she admitted. "But I wouldn't trade what we have now for anything. We found a way to be ourselves within this world instead of despite it." Lorenzo moved to stand behind her chair, his hands resting on her shoulders as he looked out at the city that had become their kingdom. His touch was warm and familiar, a reminder of how far they had traveled from that first night when he had been prepared to kill her for threatening his security. "I love you, Katerina Morozov-Torino," he said, using the hyphenated name she had chosen to honor both family traditions. "I love you too," she replied, leaning back against his chest as their child moved restlessly beneath her heart. 9 months later, Elena Morozov-Torino entered the world surrounded by more protection than most world leaders, her first breath drawn in a private hospital wing secured by both Russian and Italian forces. She was beautiful and perfect and completely oblivious to the empire that awaited her inheritance, the legacy of 2 people who had found love strong enough to transform hatred into partnership. As Katerina held her daughter for the first time, watching Lorenzo's face soften with wonder as he touched tiny fingers and counted perfect toes, she realized that her journey from prisoner to princess to partner had led to something better than any ending she could have imagined. They had built an empire founded on love rather than fear, a future that promised their daughter could be both powerful and free, both protected and authentic. The cleaning cart still squeaked when it moved through the halls of Torino Tower, but now it was pushed by women who knew they were valued employees rather than invisible servants. Katerina sometimes walked those same corridors, remembering the woman who had hidden there for 3 years while planning the life she actually wanted. She was no longer hiding. She was home.